The atmosphere inside the first-class cabin was calm, the hum of the engines blending with the quiet chatter of well-dressed passengers sipping on their drinks. The flight from New York to Los Angeles was just beginning to settle into its rhythm, and the attendants were making their rounds, ensuring that every passenger was comfortable. Father Emmanuel, a middle-aged black priest with warm eyes and a gentle smile, sat in seat 2A, gazing out the window at the endless sky. He was dressed in a simple but neatly pressed clerical suit, his white collar standing out against the deep black fabric. He wasn't a man of wealth, nor did he seek luxury, but today he had been upgraded to first class, a rare treat. It was a long journey, and he had a lot on his mind. The flight attendant, a tall woman with sharp features named Lisa, moved through the cabin with practiced efficiency. She had been working this route for years and knew how to handle high-paying customers, smiling at businessmen, catering to celebrities, and making sure that the first-class experience felt exclusive. But there was something about Father Emmanuel that made her pause. As she passed his seat, he smiled politely and said, "Excuse me, ma'am. May I have a glass of water, please?" Lisa barely glanced at him. Her expression shifted, a hint of annoyance flickering across her face. She had noticed him when he first boarded, dressed simply, lacking the polished arrogance of the usual first-class passengers. "I'll be with you in a moment," she said curtly before walking away. Minutes passed. Passengers around him were being served, wine, champagne, cocktails, even glasses of sparkling water placed neatly on their tray tables. Father Emmanuel waited patiently, hands folded in his lap, his thirst growing with each passing second. After a while, he gently pressed the call button. Lisa returned, her smile thin and forced. "Yes. I'm sorry to bother you," he said kindly, "but I was wondering if I could get that glass of water now?" Her lips pressed together. "We're prioritizing first-class guests at the moment," she said, her tone slightly sharper. He blinked, confusion crossing his face. "I am in first class." She sighed, shifting on her feet. "Sir, we're very busy right now. If you need water, there are bottles in economy. I suggest you head back there." A hush seemed to settle over the seats nearby. A businessman in the next row glanced over the rim of his glass. A young woman with headphones on turned down her music slightly. Father Emmanuel met Lisa's gaze, his expression unreadable. He had encountered dismissiveness before. He knew what it felt like to be judged before a word was spoken. But something about this moment felt different. "I see," he said quietly, nodding. "Thank you." Lisa gave a tight smile and walked away without another word. What she didn't know, what no one in that cabin knew, was that Father Emmanuel wasn't just any passenger. He came from a family that had built something incredible, something she would soon come to regret overlooking. Because this airline? It belonged to them. And in just a few hours, when they landed, Lisa's world was about to change. Father Emmanuel sat still, his hands resting lightly on his lap, his fingers gently brushing against the fabric of his trousers. His face remained calm, but inside, a storm of thought swirled. He wasn't angry. No, anger wasn't something he allowed to settle in his heart. He had spent years learning patience, understanding, and grace. But disappointment? That was something different. He had seen this kind of behavior before. It wasn't new to him. The way people judged based on appearances, the way some carried an air of quiet superiority, assuming they knew someone's worth at a glance. Lisa's dismissive attitude wasn't just about water. It was about something deeper. Something unspoken. Across the aisle, a middle-aged man in a suit caught Emmanuel's eye. The man gave a small nod, as if he, too, had noticed what had just happened. He hesitated for a moment, then leaned slightly toward the aisle. "Excuse me," the man said, signaling Lisa as she walked by. "Could I trouble you for another glass of water?" Lisa turned to him with a wide, professional smile. "Of course, sir. I'll bring that right away." Within seconds, she returned with a crystal-clear glass of water, placing it gently on his tray table. "There you go," she said cheerfully. Father Emmanuel watched the exchange, his chest rising with a quiet sigh. It was such a small thing, yet it spoke volumes. Lisa didn't even glance his way as she moved to the next passenger. The man across the aisle, now holding his glass of water, gave Emmanuel a knowing look before taking a slow sip. Father Emmanuel turned his gaze back to the window. The clouds below stretched endlessly, a soft, rolling sea of white. The irony wasn't lost on him, soaring above the world, yet still grounded by the weight of human nature. A few rows back, a young woman had been watching the whole time. She wasn't sure why it bothered her so much, but something about the way Lisa had acted felt wrong. She had seen how easily the other passengers were served, how effortlessly the flight attendant had smiled at them. And then there was this man, the priest, who had asked for nothing more than a simple glass of water, only to be treated as if he didn't belong. She leaned over to the person next to her, whispering, "Did you see that?" The person, a young man in headphones, glanced up, following her gaze. "See what?" The way she just ignored him. The man shrugged. "Yeah, kind of weird." He paused, then added, "But it happens." The woman frowned. She didn't like that answer. She turned back to look at Father Emmanuel, who still hadn't been given his water. Something about his posture, his quiet patience, made her feel even worse. He wasn't making a scene. He wasn't complaining. He was just waiting. Lisa, meanwhile, continued her rounds, unaware of the small ripple her actions had created. To her, it was just another flight, just another passenger. But for Father Emmanuel, this was more than just a flight. It was a test. He reached down, pulling out a worn leather-bound book from his carry-on. It was his father's Bible, one he had carried for years, filled with notes, bookmarks, and prayers scribbled in the margins. He ran his fingers over the cover before opening it, his eyes scanning familiar words that had guided him through so much in life. A memory surfaced. His father, sitting in their family study, explaining the value of humility, kindness, and patience. "Son," his father had once said, "the true measure of a person isn't found in how they treat those above them, but in how they treat those they think are beneath them." The words stayed with him, echoing in his mind as he sat there in silence. He knew that Lisa had no idea who he was. She didn't know about his family. She didn't know that the airline she worked for, the one she took so much pride in serving first-class passengers on, belonged to the very man she had just dismissed. And yet, he didn't feel the need to correct her. Not yet. The young woman who had been watching couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling in her chest. Finally, she made a decision. She pressed her own call button. Lisa arrived quickly, her usual polite smile on display. "Yes, ma'am. Could I get a glass of water, please?" "Of course," Lisa said, nodding. "I'll bring it right away." As Lisa walked off, the young woman glanced toward Father Emmanuel again. She wanted to see what would happen. Would Lisa bring his water now? Would she realize her mistake? A minute passed. Then another. Lisa returned and placed a glass of water on the young woman's tray table, smiling warmly. "Here you go." The woman hesitated, then asked, "Could you also bring one for him?" She subtly gestured toward Father Emmanuel. Lisa's smile faltered for the briefest moment. We have a service schedule and—" The young woman raised an eyebrow. "I just watched you bring water to everyone else." Lisa opened her mouth, then closed it. She cleared her throat. "I'll check on that," she said before quickly walking away. The young woman sat back, crossing her arms. She didn't like confrontation, but something about this moment made her stomach twist. Father Emmanuel, meanwhile, had seen the exchange. He offered the woman a small smile and a nod of gratitude, but he remained quiet. The tension in the cabin was subtle, but it was growing. More passengers had noticed now. A few exchanged glances, whispering among themselves. It was a small thing, but small things had a way of becoming something much bigger. Lisa, still unaware of how much attention she had drawn, disappeared into the galley. And as the plane continued its smooth flight toward Los Angeles, the weight of the moment hung in the air, unspoken but undeniable. Father Emmanuel simply closed his eyes and waited, because he knew, before this flight landed, the truth would come out. Lisa stepped into the galley, exhaling sharply as she leaned against the counter. She didn't understand why that small interaction had unsettled her. It wasn't like she had done anything wrong. Flight attendants had a routine to follow, and first class wasn't just about the price of a ticket, it was about the experience. Some people simply didn't fit the image of first-class travelers, and whether she wanted to admit it or not, she had made a judgment the moment she saw the priest. But now, she could feel eyes on her. The quiet murmurs, the glances, it was subtle, but she wasn't imagining it. She pulled out a bottle of water and stared at it for a moment, her fingers gripping the cool plastic. Something in her hesitated. Why was she even thinking about this so much? It was just water. Still, she set the bottle down and busied herself with another task. Out in the cabin, the tension had shifted. People who had initially ignored the exchange were now paying attention. The businessman across from Father Emmanuel had seen enough. He pressed his call button. When Lisa returned, he smiled politely. "I'd like another drink, please." "Of course," she said, relieved to move on to something routine. "What can I get you?" He glanced at the menu briefly before setting it down. "Actually, scratch that. I'll just take a glass of water." Lisa's fingers twitched. Another request for water. Another moment where she felt the quiet pressure creeping in. "I'll bring that right out," she said with a forced smile, then walked away. When she returned, she placed the glass on his tray, but before she could turn away, he spoke again. "I couldn't help but notice," he said casually, "that the gentleman over there never got his water." He nodded toward Father Emmanuel. "Is there a reason for that?" Lisa stiffened. "Oh, I was just about to bring it." The businessman smiled, but there was something sharp in his expression. "That's good to hear." Lisa turned quickly, feeling the heat creep up her neck. She hurried back to the galley, grabbed the bottle she had left sitting on the counter, and poured a fresh glass of water. As she walked back to Father Emmanuel, she forced her best professional smile and placed it in front of him. "Here you go, sir. Apologies for the delay." Father Emmanuel met her eyes, and for a brief second, she felt something unexpected. Something that unsettled her even more than the murmurs of the passengers. He wasn't angry. There was no resentment in his face. Instead, there was patience, understanding, as if he knew exactly why she had acted the way she did. He nodded. "Thank you." Lisa turned away quickly, relieved to have the moment over. But it wasn't over. The businessman, the young woman, and several other passengers exchanged glances. The flight might have been smooth in the air, but something was shifting within the cabin. The way Lisa had handled the situation wasn't sitting right with them. Father Emmanuel lifted the glass, taking a small sip, before setting it down carefully on his tray table. A few rows back, an older woman whispered to her husband. "Did you see that?" "I did," he murmured, shaking his head. "Unbelievable." Meanwhile, at the front of the plane, the co-pilot emerged from the cockpit and stretched his arms before stepping into the galley for a quick break. He greeted Lisa with a friendly nod. "How's it going out here?" Lisa forced a smile. "Just another flight." The co-pilot chuckled. "Well, let's hope it stays that way." But Lisa wasn't so sure anymore. She could feel the shift in the air, a slow building pressure that hadn't been there before. And soon, she was going to realize that this wasn't just another flight. The hum of the engines filled the cabin, but the tension had settled into the space between the passengers. Conversations were quieter now. Stolen glances exchanged between those who had noticed the moment between Lisa and Father Emmanuel. It wasn't just about the water anymore. It was about something unspoken, something that had lingered in the air long after the glass had been placed on his tray. Lisa moved quickly through the aisles, tending to other passengers, but she could feel it. The weight of it. The way people's gazes lingered on her a second longer than usual, the way their smiles felt tighter, less friendly. She hated that feeling. The feeling of being watched, of being silently judged. Near the cockpit, the co-pilot finished his break and returned to his seat, but not before catching sight of Father Emmanuel. He did a double take, his brows knitting together slightly as if something about the priest seemed familiar. He shook it off, but a nagging feeling settled in the back of his mind. Back in first class, the businessman who had spoken up earlier leaned toward the young woman across the aisle. "Something feels off about all this." She nodded. "Yeah. And I don't think that priest is just some regular passenger." He glanced at Father Emmanuel, who sat calmly with his hands folded, his expression unreadable. The man had an air about him, not one of wealth, but of quiet power. Lisa, feeling the need to regain control of the situation, turned to the older couple near the front. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked, forcing her most professional tone. The woman hesitated, then spoke carefully. "No, dear, we're fine. But," she gave Lisa a pointed look, "I do hope every passenger is receiving the same level of service." Lisa's stomach twisted. "Of course, ma'am." But as she walked away, she clenched her jaw. Why was this becoming such a big deal? It was just a misunderstanding. That's all. Or at least, that's what she kept telling herself. Further back in the cabin, a flight supervisor named Mark had been quietly observing. He wasn't in first class often, but something about the atmosphere had pulled him in. As he passed by, he noticed the way Lisa moved, stiff, nervous. It wasn't like her. He approached her near the galley. "Everything okay?" Lisa forced a smile. "Yeah, just busy." Mark studied her, then glanced toward Father Emmanuel. Something about the man felt important. He wasn't sure why, but something in his gut told him there was more to this than what it seemed. Then, the co-pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'll be beginning our descent into Los Angeles shortly. Please ensure your seat belts are fastened." Lisa exhaled. They were almost there. Just a little longer, and she could put this whole situation behind her. But as the plane started descending, something unexpected happened. A man in the very front of first class, an older gentleman in a tailored suit, stood up. He had been silent the entire flight, keeping to himself. But now, he turned slowly and looked straight at Lisa. And then he looked at Father Emmanuel. Lisa's stomach dropped. Because that man? That was Thomas Kingsley, the CEO of the airline. Lisa felt her breath hitch as recognition slammed into her like a tidal wave. Thomas Kingsley, the CEO of the airline, was standing just a few feet away, his sharp eyes moving from her to Father Emmanuel. She had served him before on past flights, always ensuring the utmost professionalism whenever he was on board. But this time, he wasn't just another first-class passenger. This time he had seen everything. Her heart pounded as she scrambled to compose herself, forcing a polite smile. Maybe, just maybe, he hadn't noticed the details of what had happened. Maybe he wasn't aware of the subtle tension that had been brewing around her all flight. But then, Thomas Kingsley did something that sent a chill through her. He turned toward Father Emmanuel and said, in a calm yet authoritative voice, "Father, it's been a long time." The entire cabin seemed to still. A few passengers turned their heads, others discreetly listened in, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Lisa's eyes darted between them. "Father," she whispered under her breath. Father Emmanuel looked up, a small smile forming at the corner of his lips. "It has, Thomas." Lisa's mind raced. The CEO of the airline knew this man personally? And not just in passing, but well enough to call him father? Her fingers clenched at her side. She suddenly felt like she had been dropped into the middle of a conversation she didn't understand. Thomas Kingsley took a step closer, speaking with the warmth of an old friend. "My father always spoke highly of you. You guided our family through some of our most difficult moments." Lisa's stomach twisted painfully. This man, the priest she had dismissed, ignored, and judged, was someone important. Not just in a way that demanded respect, but in a way that carried real weight, real history. She had assumed he was just another passenger. She had assumed he didn't belong in first class. And now, she was realizing just how wrong she had been. Passengers whispered quietly, their curiosity heightening with every passing second. The businessman who had defended Father Emmanuel leaned back slightly, an amused expression crossing his face. He had suspected something was off, but even he hadn't expected this. Lisa swallowed hard, her throat dry. "You know each other?" Thomas Kingsley turned toward her, and for the first time in the entire flight, Lisa felt genuinely nervous. "Father Emmanuel isn't just a priest," Kingsley said, his voice level but firm. "He's the spiritual advisor to my family. And more than that," he glanced at Father Emmanuel before turning back to Lisa, "he's part of the reason this airline even exists today." Lisa's mind reeled. The weight of the revelation crashed into her all at once. This wasn't just any man sitting in first class. This wasn't just a passenger she had brushed aside. This was someone deeply connected to the very foundation of the company she worked for. And she had treated him as if he didn't deserve a simple glass of water. Father Emmanuel remained quiet, his expression unreadable. He had said nothing, done nothing to expose her. Yet somehow, that made her feel even worse. The businessman shook his head, smirking slightly. "Well, that's a twist." The young woman who had spoken up earlier crossed her arms. "Guess it's a good thing some of us were paying attention." Lisa's pulse pounded in her ears. She wanted to disappear. But the worst part? This wasn't even over yet. The silence that followed Thomas Kingsley's words was deafening. Lisa felt like the floor beneath her had vanished, leaving her weightless and exposed. She could feel the gazes of the passengers burning into her, waiting for her reaction, waiting for the next move. Her palms were damp, her throat dry, and yet, she couldn't bring herself to speak. Father Emmanuel, however, remained as composed as ever. He didn't gloat, didn't revel in the shift of power. Instead, he simply studied Lisa with an expression that was neither angry nor disappointed, just knowing. It was that look, more than anything, that made her chest tighten. Lisa turned back to Thomas Kingsley, searching for some kind of lifeline. "Sir, I didn't realize." Thomas lifted a hand, silencing her. "I know you didn't." His voice wasn't harsh, but it held the weight of authority. "And that's the problem, isn't it?" Lisa felt a lump form in her throat. He sighed, glancing toward Father Emmanuel before continuing. "I built this airline with the values my father instilled in me. Respect, dignity, fair treatment for all passengers, no matter who they are or what they look like." His sharp gaze flicked back to Lisa. "Tell me, do you think you lived up to those values today?" Lisa's stomach twisted painfully. She wanted to defend herself, to explain that it was just a moment, just a mistake, but the truth sat heavy on her chest. No excuse would be good enough. She swallowed hard, her voice barely above a whisper. "No, sir." A few rows back, the businessman leaned forward, watching the exchange with great interest. The young woman beside him gave a small nod, as if silently affirming that justice was finally being served. Lisa turned back to Father Emmanuel, shame burning through her. "I'm so sorry, sir. I truly am." Father Emmanuel studied her for a long moment before offering a small nod. "I believe you." Relief flooded through Lisa, but it was short-lived. Thomas Kingsley straightened. "But an apology isn't enough." Lisa felt her breath hitch. He glanced toward the flight supervisor, Mark, who had been silently watching from the side. "I want a full report on this flight. Every interaction. Every passenger complaint. And I want it on my desk first thing tomorrow." Lisa's heart pounded. A report meant an official review. An official review meant consequences. Mark nodded firmly. "Understood, sir." Lisa swallowed down the panic rising in her chest. She had worked hard to get here, to be a respected flight attendant, and now, with just one mistake, it was all crumbling. But just as she thought the situation couldn't get worse, Father Emmanuel spoke again. "There's something you should know, Thomas." His voice was calm, measured. Thomas turned to him, surprised. "What is it?" Father Emmanuel exhaled slowly before speaking. "I didn't take this flight by chance." Lisa frowned, her confusion mirrored by the other passengers who had been closely watching the scene unfold. Thomas narrowed his eyes slightly. "What do you mean?" Father Emmanuel's lips curled into a small, knowing smile. "I was asked to be here." A quiet murmur rippled through the cabin. Lisa's pulse quickened. Thomas Kingsley looked at Father Emmanuel carefully. "By who?" Father Emmanuel tilted his head slightly. "Your father." The air seemed to vanish from the room. Passengers exchanged glances, unsure what they had just heard. Lisa could barely process the words. Thomas, however, stiffened. "That's not possible." Father Emmanuel nodded solemnly. "He reached out to me months ago. He was worried. Said he had seen small cracks forming in the foundation of this company. That things weren't quite what they seemed. He wanted me to see for myself. To understand what was happening." Lisa's breathing grew shallow. Thomas took a slow step back, as if trying to make sense of it all. "But my father passed away." Father Emmanuel met his gaze, unwavering. "Yes, he did. But his concerns didn't." Lisa felt a chill crawl down her spine. The passengers who had been invested in the situation now looked on with even greater intrigue. Thomas inhaled sharply, piecing everything together. "You mean to tell me that this wasn't just about today?" Father Emmanuel nodded. "This was about the bigger picture, about what happens when people stop seeing each other as equals." Lisa felt like the walls of the aircraft were closing in around her. This wasn't just about a glass of water. This wasn't just about one bad decision. It was about everything. Thomas exhaled slowly before turning to Mark. His voice was low, serious. "Forget the report. I want a full internal review of the airline's service policies. Effective immediately." Lisa's stomach dropped. Mark nodded. "I'll get started as soon as we land." Lisa felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Everything was changing. The tension in the air was thick, but beneath it, something else lingered, a sense that this moment was bigger than any of them had realized. Father Emmanuel reached for his water glass, taking one final sip before setting it down with a quiet clink. And just like that, the descent continued. Lisa had thought this flight was just another routine trip. She had been wrong. As the plane continued its descent, the weight of everything that had happened still lingered in the cabin. The passengers who had been watching the events unfold sat in reflective silence, some exchanging glances, others lost in thought. Lisa stood near the galley, her mind spinning. She felt exposed, vulnerable, as if the very foundation of her career had been shaken. She had made a mistake, one that had been seen by people who mattered. But more than that, it had been seen by people who wouldn't forget. And maybe that was what scared her the most. Father Emmanuel remained seated, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, his expression calm. He had not once raised his voice, not once demanded anything, and yet, he had commanded the attention of the entire cabin. That was a power Lisa hadn't understood before. Thomas Kingsley still seemed deep in thought, staring ahead as if seeing something far beyond the cabin walls. His father had been worried about cracks forming within the company, and now, Thomas had seen them firsthand. He had built this airline on values that meant something, and yet, somewhere along the way, things had started slipping. This flight had made that painfully clear. The co-pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing the final approach. The plane dipped lower, and Lisa swallowed hard, gripping the edge of the counter. She knew she had to face whatever came next, but the uncertainty of it all left her uneasy. A few moments later, the plane touched down smoothly, the wheels kissing the runway with a soft thud. Passengers murmured as the aircraft slowed to a taxi, the tension slowly beginning to ease, replaced by the quiet rustle of belongings being gathered. Lisa took a steadying breath before turning back toward the cabin. She wasn't sure what she expected, but when she made eye contact with Father Emmanuel, he simply gave her a small nod. It wasn't a dismissal, nor was it approval. It was something in between, acknowledgement. As the plane reached the gate, the flight attendants moved to prepare the doors, the usual routine feeling heavier than usual. When the final announcement was made and the seatbelt signs flickered off, passengers slowly began standing, pulling down their luggage and waiting to disembark. Lisa remained near the exit, her hands clasped in front of her as the first few rows filed out. She had debated slipping away, avoiding any more difficult conversations, but deep down, she knew that wouldn't solve anything. Father Emmanuel stood, adjusting his sleeves before picking up his small bag. As he reached her, he paused for a brief moment. "I hope today has given you something to think about," he said, his voice kind but firm. Lisa nodded, shame and gratitude mixing in her chest. "It has. More than I can explain." He studied her for a moment longer before giving a small smile. "Then something good came out of this." And with that, he stepped off the plane. Lisa let out a slow breath. As she turned back toward the cabin, she caught sight of Thomas Kingsley. He hadn't moved yet, still standing near his seat, watching as the last few passengers exited. When he finally stepped forward, he didn't say anything at first. Then, after a long pause, he looked at Lisa and said, "We'll talk soon." Her stomach clenched, but she nodded. She had no idea what that meant for her future, but one thing was certain. This wasn't the kind of mistake that would be ignored. As he stepped off the plane, Lisa remained frozen in place, watching as the last of the passengers disappeared through the jet bridge. The cabin was empty now, save for the crew finishing their final checks. She exhaled, feeling both exhausted and changed in ways she hadn't anticipated. This flight had started like any other, but it had ended as something she would never forget.